High in the remote peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, 13-year-old Ethan survived alone in a crumbling cabin his grandfather had left him. With winter closing in and supplies running dangerously low, he ventured deeper into the wilderness than ever before. What he discovered was a forgotten mine shaft, its entrance half hidden by decades of overgrowth. Inside, sealed away from the world, lay something that would change everything. It wasn't gold or precious stones that made his hands tremble in the darkness. It was evidence of a crime so terrible that powerful men had buried it along with their secrets. The boy didn't know it yet, but his discovery had just made him the most dangerous person in the entire valley. What had been hidden in that mine for so long? Why would finding it put an orphaned child in mortal danger? And could a boy possibly survive what was coming? The air in the Appalachian County Courthouse was thick with the smell of old wood polish, damp wool coats, and something else that Ethan couldn't quite name. The stale scent of broken dreams and legal battles fought over things that mattered far less than people pretended. He sat on a hard wooden bench near the back of the courtroom, his thin 13-year-old frame swallowed by a donated suit jacket that was 2 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up to reveal bony wrists and hands that fidgeted nervously in his lap. His short brown hair, hastily cut by a foster care worker the night before, stuck up at odd angles, and his blue eyes, still holding the bewildered look of recent grief, were fixed on the judge's bench with an intensity that came from understanding that the next few minutes would determine the entire trajectory of his life. Judge Martin Calhoun, a stern man in his late 60s, whose weathered face spoke of 4 decades presiding over the tragedies and disputes of mountain folk, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the nearly empty courtroom like a gavel strike. "We come now to the final disposition of the estate of Samuel David Cooper, deceased," he began, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the polished wooden pews. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as the judge recited the dry legal language, but his attention snapped to his Uncle Curtis, who sat 3 rows ahead with his expensive lawyer, a slick man from the city whose pressed suit and leather briefcase seemed obscenely out of place in this rural courthouse. Curtis Cooper was his mother's younger brother, a man Ethan had met only twice in his entire life, once at his parents' funeral 5 years ago, and again at his grandfather's service 6 months past. He was a soft man in his early 40s, with thinning hair slicked back with too much gel, a weak chin, and small, calculating eyes that reminded Ethan of a rat sizing up a piece of cheese. Curtis had contested the will immediately, claiming that a child of 13 was incompetent to inherit property, that the estate should pass to him as the nearest adult relative, and that Samuel Cooper had clearly been suffering from diminished mental capacity when he'd drafted his final testament. The judge, however, had reviewed the evidence with meticulous care. "After careful consideration of all arguments presented," Judge Calhoun continued, his gaze moving from the lawyer to Curtis, and finally settling on Ethan with something that might have been pity. "This court finds that the last will and testament of Samuel David Cooper is valid and binding. The property known as the Cooper Homestead, consisting of 40 acres of mountain land, and all structures thereon, is hereby awarded to Ethan James Cooper, to be held in trust until his 18th birthday, with limited access granted immediately for residential purposes." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Ethan flinch, and just like that, he was a landowner, a 13-year-old orphan who now possessed a crumbling cabin on a remote mountain that he'd visited only a handful of times in his childhood. Curtis's face turned a mottled red, his hands clenching into fists as his lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. But the decision was final. As Ethan stood to leave, guided by his temporary social worker, a mousy woman named Mrs. Patterson, who smelled of lavender and anxiety, he couldn't help but notice the small clusters of townspeople in the gallery, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. "Poor boy, doesn't know what he's inherited," one elderly woman murmured to her companion, her voice just loud enough to carry. "That mountain's been nothing but trouble since old Sam went up there. Some say it's cursed, others say he found something he shouldn't have. Either way, he ended up dead, and now the boys got it." Another voice, male and gruff, added, "Mysterious death, they called it. Fell off a cliff, they said. But Sam Cooper knew those mountains like the back of his hand. He wouldn't just fall." Ethan's steps slowed, his ears straining to catch more. But Mrs. Patterson's hand on his shoulder urged him forward. As they passed through the courthouse doors into the grey autumn afternoon, Ethan glanced back one final time and locked eyes with his uncle Curtis, who stood on the courthouse steps, his expensive lawyer already departed. The false grief and concern that Curtis had worn like a mask during the proceedings had vanished completely, replaced by something cold, hard, and calculating. His small eyes bore into Ethan with an intensity that made the boy's skin crawl, and as a thin smile curved Curtis's lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a predatory patience, Ethan understood with a clarity beyond his years that this battle was far from over. His uncle wasn't looking at him like a concerned relative, worried about a child's welfare, but like an obstacle, a temporary inconvenience standing between Curtis and something he wanted very, very badly. The drive up the mountain took nearly 3 hours, the last 40 minutes spent on a dirt road, so rutted and overgrown that Mrs. Patterson's sedan scraped bottom twice before she finally refused to go any further. She let Ethan out at the base of what could barely be called a trail, handed him a duffel bag containing his few possessions and a week's worth of donated canned goods, and drove away with visible relief, her taillights disappearing into the autumn forest like the last connection to civilization being severed. Ethan shouldered the heavy bag and began the final 2-mile hike to the cabin, following a path that was more memory than actual trail, choked with fallen branches and thick undergrowth that caught at his jeans with every step. The forest around him was a cathedral of towering oaks and pines, their canopy so dense that the afternoon sun barely penetrated, casting everything in a dim green twilight that felt ancient and watchful. He remembered this walk from childhood visits, remembered his grandfather's strong hand guiding him over the difficult spots, pointing out animal tracks and edible plants. But now he was alone, and the forest felt different, less like an adventure and more like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. After an hour of steady climbing, the trees finally opened into a small clearing, and there it stood. The cabin that was now his entire world. Ethan's heart sank. The structure looked worse than he remembered, far worse than the cheerful summer visits of his childhood, when his grandfather's presence had made even the rustic simplicity seem like magic. The log walls were still solid, testament to the skill of whoever had built it generations ago, but the roof sagged dangerously in the middle, several shingles missing to reveal dark patches of rot. 2 of the 3 windows were broken, the glass long gone, the openings now covered haphazardly with warped plywood that had weathered to a silver grey. The front porch tilted at an alarming angle, and the door hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. This wasn't a home, but a skeleton of one, a corpse of a dwelling slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness that pressed in on all sides. He climbed the groaning porch steps and pushed the door open, wincing as it scraped against the warped floorboards. The interior was a single large room, dim and musty, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, and a simple wooden table flanked by 2 chairs in the center. Against the far wall stood an iron-framed bed, its mattress spotted with mildew, and scattered throughout were the remnants of his grandfather's life. A rack of old tools hanging on pegs, a hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, stacks of firewood that had gone punky with moisture, and everywhere the dust and decay of 6 months of abandonment. On the table, covered in a fine layer of grime, sat a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Ethan set down his bag and picked up the journal with trembling hands, opening it to see his grandfather's familiar, cramped handwriting filling page after page. As the afternoon light faded and the forest outside grew dark, Ethan sat at that table in the gathering gloom, reading his grandfather's words by the beam of a small flashlight, and for the first time since the funeral, he felt the crushing weight of true loneliness settle over him, like a physical thing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of settling wood and the distant call of an owl. And in that moment, 13 years old, and utterly alone on a mountain that locals called cursed, Ethan wondered if he would survive what was coming. The first morning, Ethan woke to a cabin so cold he could see his breath, and the realization hit him with the weight of fallen stone. He had no idea how to survive here. The donated canned goods Mrs. Patterson had left would last a week at most. The cabin had no electricity or running water, and winter was creeping down from the high peaks with the patient inevitability of a predator stalking wounded prey. He spent that entire day just trying to build a fire in the stone hearth, his fingers clumsy and inexperienced as he arranged kindling the way he vaguely remembered his grandfather doing years ago. His first 3 attempts produced nothing but smoke and frustration, filling the cabin with acrid clouds that sent him coughing onto the porch. But the 4th attempt, built with shaking hands and desperate prayer, finally caught and held. The small flame felt like a miracle, and he fed it carefully, watching it grow into something that could actually push back the cold. Over the following days, he learned through painful trial and error, each mistake carrying consequences that left him hungry, cold, or sick. He tried to chop firewood with his grandfather's old axe, but nearly buried the blade in his own foot when it glanced off a knotty piece of oak. He drank from the creek without boiling at first, and spent a miserable night with cramps that left him curled on the floor. He built his fires too large and wasted precious wood, then too small and shivered through the darkness. But slowly, painfully, he began to learn. His grandfather's journal became his Bible, a survival manual written in cramped script that covered everything from building proper fires to identifying edible plants to setting snare traps for rabbits. He found the traps themselves in a wooden box under the cabin, along with fishing line, hooks, and a collection of lures that his grandfather had carved from wood and painted with meticulous care. Ethan set the snares in the locations the journal recommended, checking them each morning with a mixture of hope and dread. And on the 4th day, he found a rabbit caught in one, its neck broken cleanly. He had never killed anything before, never cleaned an animal, but hunger and necessity were brutal teachers, and by that evening he had roasted meat over his fire, the smell so intoxicating it made him dizzy. The mountain was unforgiving of ignorance and weakness, but it also provided for those willing to learn its harsh lessons. Yet as the days turned into weeks and Ethan grew leaner, harder, and more capable, he began to notice something strange in his grandfather's journal. Scattered among the practical survival advice were other entries, cryptic notes that made no sense. Watched the ridge again today. Same black truck, 3rd time this month. And they're getting bolder, need to move the evidence deeper, and most unsettling. If they find it, they'll kill to keep it buried. The water samples don't lie. Ethan read these passages over and over by firelight, trying to understand what his grandfather had been involved in, what secrets the old man had been keeping. The journal mentioned watching for vehicles on the distant logging road, staying out of sight, and trusting no one from town, especially not Sheriff Wade. On the final page, written in a hand that seemed shakier than the rest, were 4 words that made Ethan's blood run cold. They pushed me. Murder. The entry was dated 2 days before his grandfather's body had been found, at the base of Hawkins Cliff. His death ruled an accidental fall by that same Sheriff Wade. Ethan sat alone in his cabin that night, the fire crackling and the darkness pressing against the windows, understanding for the first time that his inheritance was more than just 40 acres of mountain wilderness. He had inherited a mystery, a danger, and quite possibly a death sentence. The leaves turned from green to gold to a final brittle brown, falling in drifts that covered the forest floor and marked the passage of time with a clarity that filled Ethan with growing dread. He had been on the mountain for nearly a month, and while he'd learned to keep himself alive through the basics of fire, water, and the occasional snared rabbit, the cold, hard mathematics of winter survival were becoming impossible to ignore. He had 7 cans of food left. His clothes were threadbare and inadequate for the brutal mountain winters his grandfather had described in the journal, and the wood he'd managed to split and stack would last perhaps 2 weeks once the real cold arrived. The nearest town, a small collection of buildings called Millbrook, was a full day's hike down the mountain, and his total wealth consisted of $12.37 in coins he'd found scattered in the cabin's drawers. It wasn't enough, not even close, and the reality of potentially starving or freezing to death before his 14th birthday was no longer an abstract fear, but a mathematical certainty, unless something changed. In desperation, he'd taken down his grandfather's old rifle from above the fireplace, a bolt-action Winchester that had probably been manufactured before Ethan was born, and attempted to hunt deer like the journal described. He'd found the ammunition easily enough, a box of cartridges stored in a tin, and he'd spent hours learning to load and aim the heavy weapon, but actually finding and killing a deer proved impossible for a 13-year-old boy with no real training. He saw them occasionally, shadows moving through the trees at dawn, but they vanished long before he could get within range, spooked by his clumsy approach and labored breathing. After a week of failed attempts, he'd returned to his snares, accepting that rabbit and the increasingly rare fish from the creek would have to sustain him. It was on a cold evening in late October, as he returned from checking his trapline, that he noticed something that stopped him cold. There, in the soft mud where the old trail met the clearing around his cabin, were fresh tire tracks, deep grooves cut by a heavy vehicle with aggressive tread. They came within 50 yards of the cabin before stopping, then turned in a wide circle and headed back down the mountain. Ethan's heart began to hammer. No one had visited him. No one had knocked on his door or called out a greeting. Someone had driven up to his property, stopped just out of sight, and watched before leaving. He examined the tracks carefully in the fading light, noting that they couldn't be more than a few hours old, made while he'd been deep in the woods. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on the creaking bed, the rifle within arm's reach, listening to every sound the forest made, jumping at the snap of branches and the call of night birds. Around midnight, he rose and went to the window that faced down the valley, the one with the least warped piece of plywood that allowed a narrow view through a gap. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Far below, where the logging road cut through the valley, perhaps 2 miles distant, were headlights. A vehicle sat motionless on that road, its lights pointed up the mountain, directly toward his cabin. It wasn't moving, wasn't traveling anywhere, just sitting in the darkness like a pair of predator's eyes, watching prey. Ethan watched those lights for over an hour, his body tense, and his mind racing with questions and fears, until finally, without ever moving, they simply went dark, and the valley returned to absolute blackness. He didn't sleep at all that night, and when dawn finally came, cold and grey, he made a decision that would change everything. He would go back to the mine his grandfather had marked on that hidden map, the place the journal warned him to stay away from. Because whatever secret was buried, there was worth watching for, worth someone driving up a forgotten mountain trail to keep an eye on an orphaned boy, and possibly worth killing for. The storm arrived without warning, on a morning that had dawned clear and deceptively calm, the sky a pale blue that promised nothing of the violence to come. Ethan was outside splitting wood, his technique improved enough that the axe now bit cleanly through most logs. When the temperature dropped so suddenly, he could feel it like a physical wall moving through the forest. Within minutes the wind picked up, bending the tall pines and sending dead leaves spiraling into the air. And then the snow began, Not the gentle flakes of a normal autumn dusting, but thick, heavy curtains of white that reduced visibility to mere feet within the span of a dozen heartbeats. He barely made it back to the cabin before the full fury hit, his arms loaded with what little wood he'd managed to split, and as he slammed the door against the shrieking wind, he realized with a sinking dread that he hadn't prepared nearly enough. The storm was a living thing, a howling beast that threw itself against the cabin with relentless fury, finding every crack and gap in the old structure and exploiting it mercilessly. Snow blew in through the broken windows despite the plywood, forming small drifts on the floor, and the roof, already compromised by years of neglect, began to leak in a dozen places as the weight of accumulating snow found the weakest points. Ethan spent the first day rushing around with every pot, pan, and cup he could find, placing them under the steady drips while the wind screamed and the cabin groaned like a ship in a terrible sea. By the second day, he'd burned through half his firewood, just keeping the temperature above freezing, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The world outside was an impenetrable wall of white, and even the short distance to the woodpile he'd started near the cabin was impossible to navigate. He was trapped, cold, and increasingly aware that he might have seriously miscalculated his ability to survive alone on this mountain. It was during the third day, as he huddled near the fire to conserve warmth and wood, that boredom and a desperate need for distraction drove him to examine his grandfather's journal more carefully than he had before. He'd read the survival instructions and the cryptic warnings dozens of times, but now he went through it, page by page, looking at the margins, the inside covers, anywhere something might be hidden. It was tucked into the back cover, glued so carefully to the leather that it was nearly invisible, a piece of paper folded into a tiny square. He worked it free with cold, stiffened fingers and carefully unfolded it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map, beautifully detailed despite being rendered in simple pencil, showing the mountain terrain for miles in every direction. His grandfather had marked the cabin's location with a small square, and from there, trails and landmarks spread across the paper like veins. But it was the markings that caught Ethan's attention and held it. Scattered across the map were 7 locations, each marked with a bold X, and beside each X were notes in his grandfather's script. Sample Site 1, positive for arsenic. Barrel dump, Esjon 50 containers, contaminated creek source. The largest X, located about 3 miles northeast of the cabin, was circled multiple times in heavy pencil strokes, and beside it, written in letters so harsh they'd nearly torn through the paper, were the words, "Old Garrison Mine. Stay away. Evidence here. Dangerous." Ethan stared at those words as the storm raged outside, as melted snow dripped into pots around him, as his fire burned low and his supplies dwindled. Stay away. His grandfather had written those words as a warning, perhaps to himself, perhaps to whoever might find this map after him. But Ethan's mind was already racing, connecting pieces he'd been too young or too naive to see before. The cryptic journal entries, the fresh tire tracks, the watching headlights in the valley, his grandfather's final words claiming murder. And now, this, a map to something hidden in an abandoned mine, something dangerous enough to warrant multiple warnings. The storm had trapped him for now, but when it broke, when the snow settled, and the trails became passable again, Ethan knew exactly where he was going. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed into something alien and beautiful, the forest buried under 2 feet of fresh snow that sparkled in the weak morning sun, like a blanket of crushed diamonds. Ethan stood on the sagging porch, surveying the damage and taking stock of his situation with the cold clarity of desperation. He had 3 cans of food left, enough firewood for perhaps 5 more days if he was careful, and the certain knowledge that another storm like the last one would likely kill him. The temperature had dropped brutally, his breath pluming thick in the air even at midday, and this was only early November. The true winter, the killing cold his grandfather had written about, was still weeks away. He couldn't stay here and slowly starve, couldn't hike to town with no money and no plan, and couldn't simply wait for help that he knew would never come. The decision, when it finally crystallized in his mind, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He would go to the mine. His grandfather's warnings echoed in his head, all those harsh letters telling him to stay away. But those same warnings also promised something there, something called evidence, something important enough that people were watching this mountain. Perhaps there were supplies, old equipment he could salvage or sell. Perhaps there was an explanation for everything strange that had happened. At the very least, he would know what secret had gotten his grandfather killed, and that knowledge felt worth the risk. He spent the morning preparing with a methodical care born from his grandfather's journal teachings. He found an old canvas rucksack hanging on a peg, musty but still serviceable, and packed it with deliberate precision. A coil of rope went in first, the kind climbers used, still strong despite its age. His flashlight, a heavy metal cylinder that ran on batteries he'd found in a drawer, went next, along with a spare set of batteries wrapped in cloth. A box of waterproof matches, a bottle filled with water from the creek, and the last of his food, 2 cans of beans and a can of peaches, rounded out the supplies. He strapped his grandfather's hunting knife to his belt, the blade freshly sharpened on a whetstone, and folded the precious map into his jacket pocket. The rifle he left behind, too heavy and cumbersome for what he hoped would be a quick exploration. At dawn on the 5th day after the storm, with the map clutched in one hand and the rucksack heavy on his thin shoulders, Ethan set out into the wilderness. The journey was immediately difficult, the deep snow making every step an exhausting battle, but he pushed forward with the stubborn determination of a boy who'd already survived more than most adults would have thought possible. He followed the landmarks his grandfather had drawn, using a distinctive split boulder as his first waypoint, then a lightning-struck pine that stood like a blackened finger pointing at the sky. The forest was utterly silent, except for the crunch of his boots and his own labored breathing, the snow muffling all sound and creating a sense of moving through a vast white cathedral. After 2 hours of steady climbing, his legs burning and his lungs aching from the cold air, the terrain changed. The trees thinned, giving way to a rocky slope, and there, half hidden by a recent rock slide and decades of overgrowth, was a dark opening in the mountainside. The entrance to the old garrison mine yawned before him like a mouth leading into the earth's throat, and despite the cold, despite his exhaustion, Ethan felt a thrill of fear and excitement run down his spine. His grandfather's warning whispered in his memory, but he'd come too far to turn back now. He checked his flashlight, adjusted the straps on his pack, and took his first step into the darkness, crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The mine entrance was not what Ethan had expected. In his imagination, formed by adventure stories and old movies, he'd pictured a grand opening with timber supports and perhaps rusted rail tracks leading into the mountain. But the reality was far more sinister. The opening itself was little more than a ragged hole in the rock face, perhaps 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, partially obscured by a massive fallen oak tree that looked like it had come down years ago. Thick vines and brambles had woven themselves around the collapsed stone, creating a natural screen that rendered the entrance nearly invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. He began clearing away the undergrowth, pulling at the vines with his gloved hands, and as he worked, he noticed something that made him pause. Carved into the smooth rock face beside the entrance, at about eye level for an adult, were symbols. They were not the simple X marks or initials that miners typically left, but rather a series of deliberate angular cuts forming patterns that looked almost like letters, but weren't quite. He traced them with his finger, feeling the depth of the grooves, and realized they'd been made with care and purpose, perhaps as a warning or a marker for someone who knew how to read them. Below the symbols, barely visible under decades of weathering and lichen growth, were scratched words in English, sealed 2009, "Do not enter." The date sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. His grandfather had died in 2024, which meant this mine had been sealed 15 years before his death. Yet the old man's map had marked it as important, had warned about evidence being stored here. As Ethan pulled away more of the concealing vegetation, the true nature of the entrance became shockingly clear. The collapse wasn't the result of age or natural settling, but of deliberate destruction. The rock face showed the telltale scorch marks and fracture patterns of explosive charges, and the rubble that partially blocked the opening had been arranged, not fallen randomly. Someone had blown the entrance, probably using dynamite or something similar, and then carefully disguised their work to make it look like an old natural cave-in. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted to just close the mine, but to make it disappear, to erase it from memory and map alike. Yet they hadn't completely sealed it. Either they'd run out of explosives, been interrupted, or deliberately left a gap. Because there at the bottom of the rubble pile was a space, a crawlway perhaps 2 feet high, leading into absolute darkness. Ethan knelt and shined his flashlight into the gap. The beam cut through the black, illuminating a passage that opened up after about 10 feet of tight crawling. The air that flowed from the opening was cold and stale, but breathable, carrying with it the mineral smell of deep earth and something else, something faintly chemical that he couldn't identify. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to return to his cabin and forget he'd ever seen this place. But the memory of his dwindling supplies and the watching headlights in the valley pushed him forward. This mine held answers, held perhaps the key to understanding why his grandfather had died, and why someone was still interested in this mountain. He checked his flashlight one more time, tightened the straps on his rucksack so it wouldn't catch on the rocks, and got down on his belly. The stone was cold, even through his jacket, as he began to crawl into the mountain's throat, the circle of daylight behind him growing smaller with each struggling movement forward, until finally he emerged into a larger space, stood on shaking legs, and found himself standing in a passage that led deep into darkness, a passage that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide from the world. Ethan stood in the entrance chamber, his flashlight beam a thin white cone, cutting through darkness so complete it felt solid, and took his first cautious steps into the old garrison mine. The passage ahead sloped downward at a steep angle, and the floor slick with moisture and loose gravel that shifted treacherously under his boots. Rotting timber beams, installed perhaps a century ago by men long dead, supported the ceiling at regular intervals, their wood gone soft and black with decay, some visibly sagging under the immense weight of the mountain above. The air was cold enough to make his breath plume, carrying with it the deep mineral smell of stone that had never known sunlight, and a faint undertone of something chemical and wrong that made the back of his throat itch. He moved with extreme care, testing each step before committing his weight, hyper-aware that a single misstep could send him tumbling into the darkness or trigger a collapse that would bury him alive in a tomb no one would ever find. The silence was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the drip of water somewhere ahead and the sound of his own breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes of slow descent, the narrow passage suddenly opened into a much larger space. It was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow above his head and 3 separate tunnel mouths branching off in different directions. The chamber floor was littered with the detritus of abandoned industry, a rusted ore cart sitting askew on twisted rails, pickaxes with rotted handles leaning against the wall, a pile of old blasting equipment covered in decades of dust and rust. Everything spoke of a place that had been worked hard and then abandoned suddenly, the miners walking away and never returning. He played his flashlight methodically across the scene, cataloguing everything, when the beam caught something that made his heart freeze. There, In the thick layer of dust that covered the chamber floor like grey snow were footprints. They were not the faint impressions of boots from decades past, but crisp, clear prints that could not have been more than a few weeks old. Someone had been here recently, had walked through this chamber with purpose, their prints leading from the entrance passage where Ethan had just emerged and continuing toward the leftmost tunnel, disappearing into that dark throat. Ethan crouched, examining the prints more closely with trembling hands. They were from work boots, large, probably a man's size, 11 or 12, with a distinctive tread pattern still visible in the dust. Beside them, barely perceptible, was a second set of prints, smaller, but equally recent. Two people had been here, had descended into this supposedly sealed and forgotten mine, and had gone deeper into the mountain. The implications crashed over him like cold water. This wasn't an abandoned relic of history, but an active site, a place people still came to. And the fact that they'd gone to such lengths to hide the entrance meant whatever they were doing here was something they desperately wanted to keep secret. His grandfather's warnings, the sealed entrance, the watching headlights in the valley, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. This mine wasn't just a hiding place for evidence, but a place where dangerous secrets were still being kept, still being protected. And Ethan, alone and 13 years old, was standing in the middle of it with only a flashlight and his grandfather's knife for protection. He should turn back, should run while he still could, but the footprints led deeper, toward whatever truth his grandfather had died trying to expose, and despite his fear, despite every rational thought screaming at him to flee, Ethan found himself following those prints into the leftmost tunnel, descending further into the mountain's cold heart. The leftmost tunnel descended at a brutal angle, forcing Ethan to brace himself against the rough walls to keep from sliding on the slick stone, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he navigated the treacherous slope. The footprints he was following remained clear in the dust, two sets of boots that had walked this path with confidence, and after perhaps 50 feet of careful descent, the tunnel leveled out and opened into a side chamber that had been deliberately carved and expanded. This chamber was smaller than the main one, perhaps 15 feet square, but what stopped Ethan cold was the evidence of recent human activity. Unlike the main chamber with its century of abandonment, this space had been cleared, organized, and maintained. The walls had been reinforced with newer timber that showed no rot, and stacked against the far wall in neat rows were dozens of heavy-duty plastic containers, the kind used for long-term storage, each one sealed with thick, weatherproof lids and labeled with dates and codes written in permanent marker. Ethan approached slowly, his heart hammering, and read the labels on the nearest containers. Sample Set A, January 2009. Financial records 2008 to 2009. Photographic evidence, site locations 1 through 7. His hands shook as he set down his flashlight, angling it to illuminate the container marked Financial Records, and worked the clasps open. The seal broke with a soft hiss, and inside, protected by layers of waterproof bags, were hundreds of documents. He pulled out the first stack and began to read. Bank statements from something called Blackstone Chemical Corporation, showing payments to individuals whose names he recognized from his grandfather's journal. Sheriff Wade, County Commissioner Davis, even Judge Calhoun. Wire transfers in amounts of $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, all marked as consulting fees, but with dates that corresponded to his grandfather's notes about blocked investigations and dismissed complaints. Photographs showed men in expensive suits meeting in private offices, shaking hands, signing documents, all of it captured from a distance as if by someone conducting surveillance. His grandfather's surveillance, Ethan realized with a chill. The second container held soil and water samples, dozens of small glass vials carefully packed in foam, each labeled with GPS coordinates and dates, the liquid inside some of them a disturbing rust-brown color that looked nothing like the clear mountain water that should have been flowing through these hills. But it was the third container that made Ethan's blood turn to ice. He opened it with numb fingers and found himself staring at evidence bags, the kind police used, filled with what looked like dark, oily sludge and chunks of corroded metal. Beneath them was a thick report bound in a blue cover, and stamped across the front in bold red letters were the words, "Confidential, Environmental Assessment, Blackstone Chemical Corporation, Authorized Personnel Only." He pulled it out and opened to the first page. What he read there, in dry technical language that somehow made the horror worse, was a detailed analysis of illegal toxic waste dumping conducted over a period of 5 years in the mountains surrounding his cabin. The report documented 847 barrels of industrial waste containing arsenic, lead, mercury, and a dozen other chemicals, with names Ethan couldn't pronounce, all of it buried in shallow pits and old mine shafts throughout the valley. The groundwater contamination projections showed a plume of poison spreading slowly through the aquifer that supplied drinking water to 3 towns and over 2,000 people. The final page of the executive summary contained a single paragraph that had been highlighted in yellow. Recommendation: immediate excavation and proper disposal required. Estimated cost: $45 million. Failure to remediate will result in widespread health effects, including cancers, neurological damage, and birth defects within 15 to 20-year timeframe. Legal liability: catastrophic. The report was dated March 2009, 15 years ago, and it had never been made public, never been acted upon, buried here in this mine, along with the evidence of the crime it documented, hidden by men who valued profit over the lives of everyone living in the valley below. Ethan sank to the cold stone floor of the chamber, the thick report spread across his lap, and began to read by the harsh white beam of his flashlight, piecing together a story so horrifying that his hands trembled with each turned page. The document was technical, filled with charts and graphs and chemical formulas that meant little to him, but the narrative that emerged was crystal clear and absolutely damning. In 2004, Blackstone Chemical Corporation had won a contract to dispose of industrial waste from manufacturing plants across 3 states, waste so toxic it required special handling and federally approved disposal sites that charged premium rates for safe containment. Instead of paying those rates, a group of executives had made a different calculation, one measured purely in profit margins and criminal conspiracy. They had hired local contractors, paid off local officials, and begun a systematic dumping operation in the remote Appalachian Mountains, where enforcement was lax and people asked few questions. Over a period of 5 years, from 2004 to 2009, they had buried 847 drums of 55 gallons each in shallow pits scattered across the mountainsides, in old mine shafts, in ravines and valleys that seemed far from human habitation. The waste contained a nightmare catalogue of poisons: arsenic, lead, mercury, chromium, industrial solvents, and compounds with long chemical names that the report described as carcinogenic and neurotoxic. His grandfather, Samuel Cooper, had worked as a surveyor for the county, and in early 2008, while conducting a routine boundary assessment, he'd stumbled across one of the dump sites. Where another man might have reported it through official channels and trusted the system to work, Samuel had been wise enough to understand that the system was corrupted. He'd begun his own investigation, working alone, using his surveying skills to locate other dump sites, collecting samples, taking photographs, and most damning of all, obtaining an internal Blackstone assessment that laid out the entire operation and its projected consequences. That assessment, the very document Ethan now held, had been commissioned by Blackstone's own Environmental Compliance Office in 2009, when rumors of the dumping began to surface. The scientists they'd hired had been brutally honest in their conclusions. The barrels were already leaking, their contents seeping into the soil and migrating downward through layers of porous limestone toward the massive underground aquifer that supplied the entire valley. The contamination plume was spreading at a rate of approximately 200 feet per year, and within 15 to 20 years, it would reach the wells, springs, and creeks that provided drinking water to the towns of Millbrook, Riverside, and Clayton Hollow. The health effects would be catastrophic: elevated cancer rates, particularly leukemia and liver cancer, neurological damage in children, birth defects, kidney failure, and a host of other conditions that would devastate the population. The report recommended immediate remediation at a cost of $45 million. Instead, Blackstone had buried the report, buried the evidence, and when Samuel Cooper had threatened to expose them, they had buried him too, pushing an old man off a cliff and calling it an accident. Ethan's mind raced as he calculated the timeline with a growing sense of horror. The report was dated 2009, 15 years ago. The contamination was supposed to reach critical levels within 15 to 20 years. That meant right now, at this very moment, people in the valley were drinking poisoned water. He thought of the townspeople he'd seen at the courthouse, of the old woman who'd called the mountain cursed, of the shopkeeper who'd warned him about his inheritance. How many of them were already sick? How many were dying from cancers they thought were just bad luck? Never. Knowing they were being slowly murdered by corporate greed? His grandfather had known, had spent the last years of his life gathering this evidence, hiding it here in this mine, and trying to find someone trustworthy enough to bring it to light. They'd killed him for it, and now Ethan, a 13-year-old orphan alone on a mountain, held in his shaking hands the power to save thousands of lives if he could survive long enough to get this evidence to someone who could act on it. Ethan worked quickly, his hands shaking as he selected the most damning evidence from the containers, knowing he couldn't carry everything, but needing enough to prove the conspiracy beyond any doubt. He took the confidential environmental assessment, a thick stack of the financial records showing payments to Sheriff Wade and the others, several of the photographs, and a handful of the labeled sample vials, packing them carefully into his rucksack with layers of cloth between each item to prevent breakage. He had just sealed his pack and was preparing to leave when a sound froze him in place. A sound so unexpected and terrifying in this buried chamber that his heart seemed to stop mid-beat. Voices, distant but clear, echoing from somewhere in the main tunnel. Someone else was in the mine. His flashlight went out instantly, plunging him into absolute darkness as he fumbled for the switch with nerveless fingers, and he stood paralyzed, listening to the voices grow louder, closer, accompanied by the crunch of boots on stone and the sweep of powerful LED lights that turned the darkness beyond the chamber entrance into a shifting grey glow. He moved on instinct, dropping to his knees and crawling behind a pile of old mining equipment in the corner, pressing himself into the smallest space possible, his rucksack clutched to his chest, barely daring to breathe as two men entered the chamber. The lights were blinding after the darkness, commercial-grade LED beams that swept across the walls and the stacked containers with methodical precision, and Ethan caught glimpses of them through gaps in the rusted equipment. Two figures in heavy coats and work boots, both carrying not just flashlights, but also pry bars, clearly here with purpose and preparation. "This is it," one of them said, his voice a low rumble that carried an accent Ethan recognized as local mountain dialect. "The old man's stash, just like the boss said. Thought this mine was sealed tight 15 years ago. But the crazy bastard must have found a way back in." The second voice made Ethan's blood turn to ice, because he knew it instantly, had heard it just weeks ago in the courthouse, dripping with false concern and barely concealed greed. It was his Uncle Curtis. "We need to make absolutely sure everything stays buried this time," Curtis said, his voice harder and colder than Ethan had ever heard it. "Check every container. Make sure all the evidence is accounted for. The company's getting nervous with the boy, inheriting the property. If he's half as smart as his grandfather, he might come looking, and we can't have that." The first man grunted agreement, and they began systematically opening containers, their lights sweeping dangerously close to Ethan's hiding spot as he pressed himself flatter against the cold stone, knowing with absolute certainty that if they found him here, surrounded by the evidence they'd killed to hide, he would never leave this mine alive. Ethan crouched behind the rusted mining equipment, every muscle locked in terrified stillness, as Curtis and his companion methodically opened containers, their voices echoing off the stone walls as they verified the evidence was still intact. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each second a battle against the urge to run, to breathe too loudly, to shift position and relieve the cramps building in his legs. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, Curtis spoke again. "Everything's here. Let's check the deeper chambers. Make sure the old fool didn't stash anything else." Their footsteps moved away, their lights disappearing into one of the other tunnel mouths, and Ethan seized his chance. He rose on shaking legs, his rucksack strapped tight to his back, and began creeping toward the passage that led to the entrance, moving as silently as possible through the absolute darkness. He didn't dare turn on his flashlight, relying instead on memory and the faint brush of his fingertips against the rough stone wall to guide him. The passage floor was treacherous, sloping upward now, and he moved with agonizing slowness, testing each step, his heart hammering so hard he was certain they could hear it echoing through the mine. He was perhaps halfway to the entrance, beginning to believe he might actually escape undetected, when his boot came down on a loose piece of shale. The rock shifted, rolled, and went clattering down the passage behind him, with a sound like gunshots in the profound silence. "What was that?" Curtis's voice exploded from somewhere in the depths, sharp with alarm. "Someone's in here! Go, go, go!" The shouts erupted behind him, and Ethan ran. He abandoned all pretense of stealth and sprinted through the darkness, one hand on the wall to guide him, his boots pounding against stone, the rucksack bouncing painfully against his spine. Behind him, powerful lights swept through the tunnel, and voices screamed orders, the sounds of pursuit growing louder with terrifying speed. He hit the crawl space at full speed, dropping and scrambling through on his belly, the rock scraping his back, his breath coming in panicked gasps. Light flooded the tunnel behind him, and he heard Curtis screaming, "It's the boy! It's Ethan! Don't let him get away!" He exploded from the mine entrance into the late afternoon sunlight, the sudden brightness blinding after the darkness, and without pause, without looking back, he ran into the forest. Behind him, he could hear them, emerging from the mine, could hear Curtis's voice, rising to a furious scream. "Find him! Find that boy now! He can't have gotten far, and he can't be allowed to leave this mountain." Ethan ran like his life depended on it, because it did, plunging into the dense undergrowth with the sounds of pursuit crashing through the forest behind him. The precious evidence in his backpack, the only thing standing between truth and a conspiracy that had already claimed his grandfather's life. The forest became a battlefield, and Ethan fought for his life, using every lesson his grandfather had written in that worn journal, every skill he'd painfully learned during his weeks alone on the mountain. He ran for the first 10 minutes in pure panic, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the mine. But then his grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, calm and steady. "Panic kills, boy. Slow down, think, use your head." He forced himself to stop, gasping for breath, and listened. Behind him, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, he could hear them calling his name. "Ethan! Ethan, boy! It's your Uncle Curtis! Are you hurt? We're here to help you!" The false concern in that voice made his skin crawl, but it also told him something important. They didn't know exactly where he was, didn't have a clear trail to follow. He could use that. He moved into the densest thicket of mountain laurel he could find, a tangled maze of branches that tore at his clothes and skin, forcing his way through where a grown man would struggle to follow. He found a creek, shallow and ice-cold, and walked upstream for nearly a mile, the water soaking through his boots but erasing his scent and tracks. He doubled back on his own trails twice, climbing trees and using low-hanging branches to move in directions his footprints suggested he hadn't gone, creating false paths that led nowhere. For hours he played this deadly game of cat and mouse, hearing them crashing through the forest, sometimes close enough that he could make out individual words, other times distant enough that he dared to move faster. Curtis had brought at least 3 men with him, their voices calling coordinates to each other like a military operation, and as the afternoon light began to fail and shadows grew long between the trees, Ethan realized with growing despair that they weren't giving up. They couldn't afford to let him escape, not with what he knew, not with what he carried. As full darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Ethan found himself on a steep, rocky slope, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his clothes soaked with creek water and turning stiff with ice. He couldn't keep moving in the dark without a light, and using his flashlight would give away his position instantly. He needed shelter, needed to hide until dawn. That's when he saw it, a small dark opening in the rocks, barely visible in the gloom, a shallow cave, perhaps, 6 feet deep and 4 feet high. He crawled inside, pulling dead branches across the entrance to conceal it, and collapsed against the cold stone, clutching his backpack to his chest like a lifeline. Through the branches he could see lights moving through the forest below, sweeping back and forth in a search pattern, and he could hear Curtis's voice, no longer falsely concerned, but filled with cold fury, carrying clearly through the night air. "He's just a boy. He can't survive out here in the cold. We'll find him at first light. Find him, or find his frozen body. And either way, this ends tomorrow." Ethan huddled in his cave, shivering uncontrollably, understanding with perfect clarity that his grandfather had died protecting this evidence, and unless he could somehow survive the night and get off this mountain, unless he could find someone uncorrupted to give these documents to, he would die for the same reason. Ethan waited in the cave until the searchers' lights had moved far enough away that he dared to move, then slipped out into the freezing darkness and began the agonizing journey back to his cabin. He moved by starlight and memory, every sound making him freeze in terror, expecting at any moment to hear Curtis's voice or see a flashlight beam cutting through the trees. It took him 3 hours to cover what should have been a 40-minute hike, and when he finally saw the dark silhouette of his cabin against the night sky, relief flooded through him, so powerfully his legs nearly buckled. But the relief died instantly when he got close enough to see details. The front door hung open, swinging slightly in the cold wind, and even from a distance he could see that something was terribly wrong. He approached cautiously, every sense screaming danger, and stepped through the doorway into devastation. They had been here. The cabin had been systematically ransacked, torn apart by people searching with brutal efficiency. The mattress had been slashed open, its stuffing scattered across the floor. Every drawer had been pulled out and emptied, their contents dumped in piles. The floorboards had been pried up in places, and his grandfather's few possessions had been thrown around like garbage. They'd been looking for the evidence, searching for any trace of what Samuel Cooper had hidden, and the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. No refuge would be respected. Ethan stood in the wreckage of his home, shivering with cold and fear, and faced the brutal reality of his situation. His grandfather's journal had been explicit. "Don't trust Sheriff Wade. He's in Blackstone's pocket. Bought and paid for." The very person who should have protected him, who should have investigated his grandfather's death, was part of the conspiracy. He was 13 years old, with no family, except an uncle who was actively trying to kill him. No allies in a town where everyone seemed either corrupted or too frightened to act. And proof of a crime so massive that powerful. People had already committed murder to hide it. He had no phone to call for help, no vehicle to escape, no money beyond the few dollars in his pocket. The nearest town in the next county, a place called Riverside, where the corruption might not reach, was at least 30 miles away through mountain terrain that was growing more treacherous by the day as winter settled in. It would take 2 days of hiking at minimum, 2 days exposed and vulnerable, with Curtis and his men surely watching the roads and trails. The temperature was dropping toward freezing, his clothes were still damp from the creek, and he had no food beyond the 2 cans in his ransacked cabin. Every rational calculation said his situation was hopeless, that a 13-year-old boy alone could not possibly survive what was coming. But as Ethan stood there in the wreckage, clutching the backpack that held the truth his grandfather had died for, he made a choice that was equal parts desperation and defiance. He would try anyway, because the alternative was accepting that evil men could murder with impunity, could poison an entire valley, and walk away unpunished, and he refused to let his grandfather's sacrifice mean nothing. Ethan spent the night huddled in a corner of the ransacked cabin, his grandfather's rifle across his lap, and the backpack of evidence pressed against his chest, jerking awake at every sound the old structure made as it settled in the cold. He'd barricaded the broken door as best he could with the overturned table, and had a small fire burning in the hearth, just enough to keep from freezing, but not so large it would be visible from a distance. His plan was simple. Leave at first light, hike fast and hard toward Riverside in the next county, and pray he could stay ahead of Curtis and his men long enough to reach someone who could help. But when dawn came, it came with disaster. The sky had turned a bruised purple-gray during the night, and as the first weak light touched the mountain tops, snow began to fall. Not the gentle flakes of an autumn dusting, but a heavy driving storm that came roaring out of the north with the fury of winter's first real assault. Within an hour, visibility dropped to almost nothing, the world disappearing behind thick white curtains. Within 2 hours, the temperature had plummeted to well below freezing, and the snow was already 6 inches deep and climbing fast. Ethan stood at the broken window, watching his escape route vanish under the blizzard, and felt despair settle over him like a physical weight. He couldn't travel in this. He'd be dead from exposure within hours if he tried. The storm had trapped him as effectively as iron bars, pinning him in place while his supplies dwindled to almost nothing. He spent the day fortifying the cabin against the cold, stuffing rags into the gaps around the broken door, nailing boards over the shattered windows, and feeding the fire with precious wood that he knew wouldn't last more than 2 days. The evidence in his backpack seemed to mock him. All that proof of corporate evil and conspiracy useless if he froze to death before he could deliver it to anyone who mattered. As night fell and the storm's fury only increased, Ethan saw something through the howling white chaos that made his blood turn to ice. Lights, multiple sets of headlights, struggling slowly up the mountain road that led to his property. He counted at least 3 vehicles, maybe 4, their lights diffused and scattered by the heavy snow, but unmistakably there, unmistakably coming closer. They were coming for him, Curtis and his men, willing to brave a blizzard that any sane person would have waited out, and the message was absolutely clear. They would not stop, would not give up, would not let a mere storm stand between them and silencing the boy who threatened to expose everything. Ethan backed away from the window, his hands shaking, and began to prepare for what he knew in his bones was coming. A final confrontation in a storm-lashed cabin on a mountain that had already claimed his grandfather's life, and now seemed determined to claim his as well. The vehicles stopped just beyond the clearing, their engines cutting off one by one, and through the blowing snow, Ethan watched 4 figures emerge and begin trudging toward the cabin. Even through the blizzard, he recognized the lead figure's distinctive gait, that self-important swagger that belonged to his Uncle Curtis. Behind him came 3 others, a tall, heavy-set man in a sheriff's coat that Ethan assumed was Wade, and 2 younger men in work clothes who moved with the casual confidence of people accustomed to using violence. They formed a loose semicircle around the cabin, cutting off any escape route, and Curtis climbed the sagging porch steps, his face a mask of false concern as he pounded on the barricaded door. "Ethan! Ethan! Boy, it's your Uncle Curtis! We've come to check on you. Make sure you're safe in this terrible storm. Mrs. Patterson from Social Services is worried sick about you out here all alone." His voice was warm, dripping with avuncular care. But Ethan had heard that same voice in the mine, speaking with cold calculation about making sure evidence stayed buried. "I know what you did," Ethan shouted back, his voice cracking with fear and anger. "I know about Blackstone, about the dumping, about the payoffs. I have proof. I have all of it!" The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the howl of the wind. When Curtis spoke again, the false warmth had evaporated completely, replaced by something hard and ugly. "Well then, that does complicate things, doesn't it?" He turned to the others, no longer bothering to play his part. "Sheriff Wade, you hear that? The boy's been trespassing in sealed mine shafts, stealing property that doesn't belong to him. That's a serious crime." Wade stepped forward, his voice carrying the lazy authority of a man who'd worn a badge so long he'd forgotten what it was supposed to mean. "Ethan Cooper, you need to come out right now and hand over whatever you took. This is official police business. You're in a lot of trouble, son, but we can work it out if you cooperate." "You're not taking me anywhere!" Ethan screamed, backing away from the door, the rifle trembling in his hands. "My grandfather wrote about you, Sheriff. He knew you were paid off. You're all murderers!" Curtis's laugh was cold and humorless. "All right, boy. We'll do this the hard way. You've got two choices, and I suggest you think very carefully. You can hand over those documents and come with us. We'll get you into a nice, warm foster home. Make sure you're taken care of. And in a few years, when you're older, you'll understand this was all just a misunderstanding. Or you can stay in that cabin and freeze to death when your firewood runs out in what? A day? 2? A tragic accident. A boy too stubborn to accept help in a winter storm. Either way, those documents don't leave this mountain." He gestured to his men, who began spreading out, surrounding the cabin completely. "The siege starts now, Ethan. Your choice is how it ends." The first assault came within minutes of Curtis's ultimatum, a direct attempt to force the barricaded door. 2 of the hired men threw their shoulders against it in unison, the heavy wood groaning under the impact. But Ethan had braced it with not just the overturned table, but also the iron bed frame, wedged at an angle. And the barrier held. He'd learned from his grandfather's journal that defense wasn't about strength, but about leverage and preparation, and in the hours before they'd arrived, he'd turned his ransacked cabin into a crude fortress. The windows were boarded over with planks torn from the floor, nailed in place with rusty spikes he'd found in the shed, and he'd even scattered broken glass from the shattered panes on the floor inside, creating a treacherous carpet that would shred the feet of anyone who broke through. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, not just for warmth, but as a source of light and a weapon, if needed, a poker heating in the coals within easy reach. For hours they probed his defenses, trying the door repeatedly, attempting to pry boards from windows, even climbing onto the roof to see if they could force entry from above. But the storm was Ethan's unexpected ally. The blizzard's fury made it nearly impossible to work with cold-numbed fingers, and the wind threatened to blow anyone off the steep roof. Each failed attempt was punctuated by Curtis's growing frustration, his voice rising in anger as he paced in the snow outside. "This is ridiculous! He's 13 years old! How is a child holding off 4 grown men?" Sheriff Wade's response was a grunt of irritation. "The boy's got the high ground, and the weather on his side. We try to force it, and someone's going to get hurt, maybe shot if he knows how to use that rifle. We've got time, Curtis. We wait him out. He's got maybe a day of firewood left, and then cold will do our work for us." But Curtis was beyond patience, beyond rational calculation. "We don't have time. If he somehow gets word out, if anyone comes looking, if those documents get into the wrong hands, everything falls apart. Blackstone will burn us all to save themselves, and you know it." "Keep your voice down," Wade hissed. But Curtis was past caring. He moved closer to the cabin, shouting so his voice would carry through the boarded windows. "You want the truth, boy? Fine. Here's the truth. Blackstone Chemical paid me $200,000 over 5 years to make sure your grandfather's investigation went nowhere, to make sure that evidence stayed buried. They paid the sheriff here even more. We've got houses, cars, kids in college, all because we were smart enough to take the money and keep our mouths shut. Your grandfather was a fool who couldn't accept that sometimes the world runs on deals made in the dark, and his righteousness got him killed. I was there that day on Hawkins Cliff, boy. I watched him go over the edge, and I slept just fine that night, because he brought it on himself." The confession hung in the cold air, and inside the cabin, Ethan pressed himself against the wall, tears streaming down his face, the rifle clutched in shaking hands. His grandfather's death hadn't been an accident, or even an impersonal corporate murder, but a personal betrayal, a family member choosing money over blood, choosing evil over truth. Curtis wasn't finished. "You think you're being brave, but you're just being stupid. Hand over those documents and live or die, like your grandfather died, knowing that all your defiance changed nothing. Those barrels will stay buried. Those people will keep drinking poison, and Blackstone will keep making money, because that's how the world actually works." Ethan's voice, when it came, was raw but steady. "You're wrong. People will know. Even if you kill me, the truth will come out." Curtis's laugh was bitter. "How? You've got no phone, no way to call for help, and this storm will last at least another day. By the time anyone can reach this mountain, you'll be frozen solid, and those documents will be ashes in our fire. Face it, boy, you've already lost." The turning point came as dawn approached and the storm showed no signs of breaking, the wind still howling with relentless fury and snow piling in drifts that reached halfway up the cabin's walls. Curtis had spent the night pacing like a caged animal, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt to breach the cabin's defenses, and Ethan could hear the desperation creeping into his voice as he argued with Sheriff Wade about their dwindling options. Inside the cabin, Ethan huddled near the dying fire, his wood supply down to a few pieces that would last maybe 2 more hours, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion, but still defiant, still clutching the backpack of evidence that had cost his grandfather's life. Then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold, the slosh of liquid being poured, the distinctive smell of gasoline cutting through even the wind and snow. He rushed to the crack between 2 boards covering the front window and peered out into the grey pre-dawn light. Curtis was standing in the clearing, his face twisted with rage and determination, directing the 2 hired men as they circled the cabin, pouring fuel from red jerry cans around the foundation, soaking the old dry logs. "If we can't get in, we'll burn him out," Curtis shouted over the wind. "The evidence, the boy, all of it turns to ash, and we'll tell everyone he died trying to stay warm, that the fire got out of control in the storm. A tragedy, but these things happen." Sheriff Wade grabbed Curtis's arm. "You're talking about murdering a child, burning him alive. That's too far, Curtis, even for this." Curtis shook him off violently. "It's already too far. We killed his grandfather. We're in this up to our necks. One more body doesn't change anything except whether we spend the rest of our lives in prison or keep living the good life Blackstone paid for. Now either help or get out of my way." Ethan backed away from the window, panic threatening to overwhelm him. They were going to burn the cabin with him inside, were going to murder him as surely as they'd murdered his grandfather, and he had nowhere to run, no way to escape except directly into their hands. His mind raced frantically through options and found none, until a fragment of memory surfaced, something he'd read in his grandfather's journal weeks ago, and dismissed as irrelevant. "Emergency exit through the old root cellar. Tunnel leads 50 yards north into the woods. Built it myself during the Cold War paranoia. Never thought I'd actually need it." The root cellar. Ethan spun around, looking at the cabin floor with new eyes. There, in the corner near the fireplace, beneath a threadbare rug now covered in scattered debris from the ransacking, would be the entrance. He threw aside the junk, kicked away the rug, and found it. A wooden trapdoor, its outline barely visible in the floorboards. He grabbed the iron ring handle and pulled. The door was heavy, swollen with age and moisture, but it gave way with a groan, revealing a dark square opening and a crude ladder leading down into blackness. Outside, Curtis's voice rose to a shout. "Light it! Light it, now!" Through the cracks in the boards, Ethan saw the flare of a match, saw flame touch the gasoline-soaked logs, and within seconds, the exterior walls erupted in a roar of orange fire that turned the grey dawn into hellish brightness. Smoke began pouring through every gap and crack, filling the cabin with choking fumes. There was no more time for hesitation, no time for fear. Ethan grabbed his backpack, slung it over his shoulders, and descended into the root cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed above him just as the cabin began to burn in earnest, the flames consuming his only shelter while Curtis and his men watched from the snow, certain that they'd finally won. The root cellar was a cramped, stone-lined pit, barely 6 feet square, its walls slick with moisture, and its floor covered in years of accumulated dirt, and the rotted remains of what had once been food stores. Ethan dropped into it, his boots landing in cold mud, and immediately the air grew thicker, harder to breathe, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. Above him, the roar of the fire was already audible, a hungry crackling that grew louder by the second as the flames devoured the dry timber of the cabin, and wisps of smoke were beginning to seep through the gaps around the trapdoor. He fumbled for his flashlight with numb fingers, clicked it on, and swept the beam around the small space. There, in the far wall, was what his grandfather had described. A dark opening, perhaps 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, the entrance to the escape tunnel, its mouth reinforced with ancient timber supports that looked dangerously unstable. He got down on his hands and knees, the backpack making him clumsy, and crawled into the tunnel. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, at the earthen walls pressing in on either side, and the ceiling was so low he had to keep his head down, his nose inches from the dirt floor. The air was stale and dead, and with every breath he could taste the mineral bitterness of stone and soil. He crawled forward, pushing the flashlight ahead of him, its beam illuminating only a few feet of passage before disappearing into absolute blackness. Behind him, the sounds of the fire grew muffled, but more ominous, a deep rumbling roar that vibrated through the earth itself, and he could feel heat beginning to radiate down through the tunnel entrance. The cabin was being consumed, turned to ash and ember, and if this tunnel collapsed or led nowhere, he would be entombed in the earth, buried alive in a coffin of his own desperate choosing. He crawled for what felt like an eternity, his knees and palms scraped raw against the rough ground, the backpack catching on roots and rocks that protruded from the ceiling, forcing him to stop and work it free with agonizing slowness. The tunnel was not straight, but wound slightly, following some logic of easier digging that his grandfather had employed decades ago, and Ethan had no way of knowing if he was going in the right direction or simply burrowing deeper into the mountain. Then his flashlight beam hit a wall of earth. The tunnel was blocked, collapsed at some point over the years, a solid mass of dirt and rock filling the passage from floor to ceiling. For a moment, panic overwhelmed him completely. He was trapped, caught between the fire behind and impassable earth ahead, and he would die here in the darkness, his body never found, the evidence rotting away with him. But then survival instinct kicked in, the same stubborn determination that had kept him alive through weeks of solitude and cold, and he began to dig. He clawed at the earth with his bare hands, scooping away dirt and small stones, his fingers bleeding as they scraped against rocks embedded in the collapse. The backpack made it nearly impossible to maneuver in the tight space, but he couldn't leave it behind, couldn't abandon the evidence after everything it had cost. He dug like an animal, frantic and single-minded, creating a small hollow in the blockage, then wedging himself into it and digging further. The earth was loose in places, packed hard in others, and twice small avalanches of dirt poured down on him, filling his mouth and nose, threatening to bury him even as he tried to burrow through. Time lost all meaning in that suffocating darkness. He might have been digging for minutes or hours, he couldn't tell, but slowly, agonizingly, the blockage began to yield. His bleeding fingers broke through into open space, into air that felt slightly fresher, and with a final desperate effort, he widened the hole enough to push his backpack through, then squeezed his own body after it, emerging on the other side of the collapse covered in dirt, gasping for breath, but still moving forward. The tunnel continued for another 20 yards, and then his flashlight beam caught something that made his heart leap. Wooden slats, a crude ladder leading upward, and above it, a square of slightly lighter darkness that could only be the exit. Ethan climbed the crude ladder, his arms shaking with exhaustion, his hands so torn and bloody that each rung was agony, and pushed against the wooden cover that sealed the tunnel's exit. It was heavy, weighted down by accumulated snow and frozen soil, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed, and with a final heaving effort, it gave way, swinging open and dumping a cascade of snow down onto his upturned face. He pulled himself up and out, emerging into a world of absolute chaos. The blizzard still raged with undiminished fury, the wind shrieking through the trees and driving snow horizontally across the landscape, visibility reduced to mere yards of swirling white. He was in a small hollow, about 50 yards north of where his cabin had stood, exactly as his grandfather's journal had described, concealed by dense undergrowth and a fallen log that had partially covered the exit over the years. He collapsed onto his hands and knees in the deep snow, gasping for breath, his lungs burning from the exertion, and the smoke he'd inhaled before escaping into the cellar. Every part of his body screamed in protest. His hands were shredded and bleeding, leaving bright red drops in the pristine snow. His knees were bruised and scraped raw. His clothes were soaked with a mixture of sweat, melted snow, and the mud from the tunnel, and the cold was already seeping into his bones with deadly efficiency. But he was alive, impossibly, miraculously alive, and the backpack was still strapped to his shoulders, its precious cargo intact. He forced himself to look back toward where his cabin had stood, and what he saw was both terrible and strangely beautiful. The structure was completely engulfed in flames, a massive pillar of fire that roared up into the storm-dark sky, the heat so intense that it created its own weather system, sending sparks and embers spiraling upward into the falling snow, where they died in hissing clouds of steam. The flames were visible even through the blizzard, a beacon of destruction, and silhouetted against that hellish orange glow were 4 figures standing in the snow, watching their handiwork. Curtis, Sheriff Wade, and the 2 hired men stood in a loose group, their backs to Ethan's position, clearly believing that the boy inside had been consumed by the inferno they'd created. He could hear Curtis's voice, faint and distorted by the wind, but audible in snatches. "It's done. Nobody could survive that. The evidence is ash, the boy is dead, and come spring when they find his bones, it'll be a tragic accident." Ethan didn't wait to hear more. Using the storm as his shield, and the roar of the fire to mask any sound he might make, he staggered to his feet and began moving away from the cabin, away from his would-be killers, deeper into the wilderness. Every step was a battle against the snow, which had drifted in places to above his knees, and against his own failing body that wanted nothing more than to collapse and surrender to the cold. He had no plan beyond putting distance between himself and Curtis, no destination except away, but he forced himself to keep moving, one agonizing step after another, using trees for support when his legs threatened to give out. The blizzard that had trapped him and enabled his enemies to attack was now his salvation, hiding his escape in a wall of white, covering his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. He walked for what might have been an hour, maybe more, his sense of time distorted by cold and exhaustion and the sameness of the snow-choked forest. His wet clothes were beginning to freeze, turning stiff and crackling with ice, and he could no longer feel his feet or hands. Hypothermia was setting in. He knew that much from his grandfather's survival notes, and if he didn't find shelter soon, didn't get warm and dry, He would die out here just as surely as if Curtis had succeeded in burning him alive. But with each stumbling step, with each gasping breath of frigid air, Ethan clung to one thought that kept him moving when everything else said to stop. He had survived. The evidence had survived. And somewhere in this vast wilderness, there had to be someone, anyone, who could help him expose the truth his grandfather had died to protect. Ethan's world had narrowed to the simple mechanics of survival. Lift the left foot, push it forward through the snow, shift weight, lift the right foot, repeat. He no longer felt the cold as pain, but as a spreading numbness that crept up from his extremities toward his core, a seductive drowsiness that whispered he should just stop, just rest for a moment, just close his eyes. He'd been walking for hours, the storm showing no mercy, and he had long since lost any sense of direction or purpose beyond the animal instinct to keep moving. His clothes had frozen into a rigid shell that cracked and bent with each movement, and ice had formed in his hair and eyebrows, turning him into a stumbling ice sculpture of a boy. The delirium came in waves, bringing with it hallucinations that seemed more real than the snow-choked forest around him. He saw his grandfather walking ahead of him through the trees, beckoning him forward with a gentle smile, and he tried to call out, but his voice was gone, stolen by the wind. He saw his mother and father, dead these 5 years, standing together in a clearing, their arms open wide, and some part of his fading consciousness understood that he was dying, that his brain was offering him comfort in his final moments. He stumbled, fell face first into a drift, and lay there for a long moment, the snow surprisingly warm against his frozen skin, and thought with perfect clarity. This is how it ends. This is where I die, and Curtis wins after all. But then, through the swirling white chaos, he saw it, a light, faint and golden, flickering through the trees, like a star fallen to earth. At first he thought it was another hallucination, another cruel trick of his dying mind, but when he blinked and looked again, it was still there, steady and real, the unmistakable glow of a window with a fire burning inside. He crawled toward it, no longer able to stand, dragging himself through the snow with the last reserves of strength in his shredded hands, the backpack a leaden weight on his back. The light grew brighter, closer, and he could make out the dark silhouette of a structure, a cabin larger and more substantial than his grandfather's had been, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and warm light spilling from multiple windows. He reached the porch, pulled himself up the steps on his belly like a wounded animal, and with the final dregs of consciousness, pounded on the heavy wooden door with fists he could no longer feel. The door opened almost immediately, spilling warmth and light into the storm, and a woman's voice, sharp with alarm, cut through the fog in his mind. "Sweet Lord, there's a child out here." Strong hands gripped his shoulders, pulling him inside, and he collapsed onto a wooden floor, unable to move, unable to speak, his body convulsing with violent shivers as the warmth hit his frozen skin. The woman knelt beside him, and through the haze, Ethan saw her face, weathered and lined, framed by steel-grey hair, pulled back in a practical bun, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held both kindness and steel. She was perhaps in her mid-60s, dressed in wool pants and a thick sweater, and her hands as they checked his pulse and began stripping away his frozen jacket were competent and sure. "You're Samuel Cooper's grandson," she said, not a question, but a statement of recognition. "I've seen your picture in his cabin. I'm Martha Green. I was your grandfather's friend. What in God's name are you doing out in this storm?" Ethan tried to speak, but his jaw wouldn't work, his teeth chattering too violently to form words. Martha didn't wait for an answer. She moved with practiced efficiency, calling out instructions to herself as she worked. "Hypothermia. Stage 2, maybe 3. Need to warm him slowly. Get these wet clothes off. Warm blankets. Hot liquids." She wrapped him in thick quilts that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, positioning him near the fire, but not too close, and began the careful work of bringing him back from the edge of death. It took nearly an hour before Ethan could speak, before the violent shivering subsided enough that his jaw unlocked and his mind cleared from the fog of hypothermia. Martha sat beside him, spooning warm broth into his mouth, her face patient but deeply concerned. And when he finally found his voice, cracked and raw, the words came tumbling out in a desperate flood. The mine, the evidence, Curtis and the murder, the fire, the tunnel, everything his grandfather had discovered, and everything Ethan had survived. Martha listened without interruption, her expression growing darker and harder with each revelation. And when Ethan finished, when he'd told her everything and pulled the dirt-stained backpack from where it lay beside him, opening it to show her the documents and samples that had cost his grandfather's life, and nearly cost his own, she sat back with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, and spoke words that gave Ethan the first real hope he'd felt in days. Samuel told me he was investigating something dangerous, told me if anything happened to him, I should look for evidence he'd hidden. I'm a retired investigative journalist, boy, worked for the Washington Post for 30 years before I came to these mountains. I know exactly who to call, and I still have friends who will listen. You did it, Ethan. You survived, and now we're going to make them pay. Martha Green moved through her cabin with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd spent decades chasing stories that powerful people wanted buried, and as Ethan watched from his nest of blankets by the fire, still shivering, but growing stronger with each passing hour, she transformed from a kind rescuer into something far more formidable. An investigator on the hunt. She spread the documents from his backpack across her large wooden table, handling each piece of evidence with the careful reverence of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at, her sharp eyes scanning financial records, environmental reports, and photographs with a professional's trained attention to detail. Your grandfather came to me about 6 months before he died, Martha said, not looking up from the damning bank statements that showed payments from Blackstone to Sheriff Wade. We'd been friends for years, both of us outsiders who'd come to these mountains seeking quiet after lives spent in cities. He told me he'd stumbled onto something big, something dangerous, and he was building a case. I offered to help, offered to use my old contacts to get federal investigators involved. But Samuel was stubborn. He wanted ironclad proof before he went public, wanted to make absolutely certain that when he struck, the blow would be fatal to everyone involved. She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I told him to be careful, told him these kinds of people don't play by rules, and he promised me he would. 2 weeks later, they found his body at the base of Hawkins Cliff. Sheriff Wade ruled it an accidental fall within hours, didn't even conduct a proper investigation. And I knew in my bones it was murder, but I had no proof, nothing to take to authorities who might actually care. She picked up the confidential environmental assessment, the report that laid out Blackstone's crimes in clinical detail, and her hands trembled with rage. This is it. This is what Samuel died for. This report alone is enough to trigger federal criminal investigations, EPA enforcement actions, and civil lawsuits that will bankrupt Blackstone. The financial records prove conspiracy and bribery involving local officials, which brings in the FBI. The contaminated samples provide physical evidence of environmental crimes. Ethan, your grandfather built a case that's absolutely bulletproof. Ethan's voice was hoarse but urgent. But Curtis knows I escaped. Once the storm breaks, he'll come looking. We can't just wait here. Martha's smile was thin and hard, the smile of a woman who'd faced down corrupt politicians and corporate criminals in her reporting days, and never once backed down. We're not going to wait. I have something your grandfather didn't, something I insisted on having when I moved to these remote mountains, precisely because I knew how corruption runs deep in rural places. She walked to a closet and pulled out a heavy-duty case, opening it to reveal a satellite phone, the kind used by researchers and journalists in remote locations where normal cell service didn't reach. This works anywhere, storms and mountains be damned. I have the direct numbers for 3 different federal agencies: the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and a former colleague who's now a senior editor at the New York Times. We're going to call all of them, right now, and we're going to burn Curtis and Blackstone and every corrupt official in this county to the ground. She powered up the satellite phone, its small screen glowing to life, and looked at Ethan with fierce determination. Your grandfather started this fight, and you survived hell to finish it. Now we make one call that changes everything, and we make sure Samuel Cooper's death and your suffering meant something. Are you ready? Ethan, 13 years old, orphaned, hunted, and nearly killed, but still clutching the truth that powerful men had tried to bury, nodded with a certainty that belied his years. Make the call. Martha waited until Ethan had finally surrendered to exhaustion, his body giving out after days of running and fear, his breathing settling into the deep rhythms of genuine sleep as he lay wrapped in quilts by the fire. Only then did she pick up the satellite phone and step into her small study, closing the door softly behind her. She dialed from memory, a number she'd kept in her head for 15 years, the direct line of a woman she'd worked with on dozens of investigations when they were both younger and the world had seemed more fixable. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Special Agent Ellen Reeves, EPA Criminal Investigation Division. Martha took a steady breath. Ellen, it's Martha Green. I know it's been years, but I'm calling because I have something you need to hear, and I need you to listen without interrupting, because lives depend on what happens in the next 24 hours. For the next 30 minutes, Martha laid out the entire story with the precision of a veteran journalist presenting an airtight case. The illegal dumping operation, the contaminated groundwater threatening thousands of people, the murder of Samuel Cooper, and the attempted murder of his 13-year-old grandson, the web of corruption involving local law enforcement and county officials, and most importantly, the physical evidence currently sitting on her kitchen table that could prove every word. She read from the environmental assessment, cited specific dollar amounts from the bribery records, and provided GPS coordinates for dump sites that could be verified immediately. When she finished, the silence on the other end lasted several long seconds before Agent Reeves spoke, her voice tight with controlled fury. I'm looking at a map right now. You're in the middle of a blizzard zone. The storm won't break for another 12 hours minimum, and even then, mountain roads will be impassable for at least a day. Can you keep the boys safe that long? Martha's jaw set with determination. I have a rifle, 30 years of stubbornness, and a personal score to settle for my friend's murder. We'll be here when you arrive. By dawn, the wheels of federal justice were turning with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. Agent Reeves had briefed her superiors, who'd immediately contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and the U.S. Attorney's Office. A joint task force was being assembled, EPA criminal investigators, FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and forensic teams, all being staged at the nearest city, with orders to move the moment weather permitted. Search warrants were being drafted for Blackstone's regional offices, Sheriff Wade's department, and Curtis Cooper's home and financial records. The machine of federal law enforcement, once pointed at a target, was relentless and overwhelming. But Martha was right about the storm. It raged through that day and into the night, keeping the federal agents grounded, while Curtis and Sheriff Wade, believing their problem literally burned to ashes, had returned to town. Martha kept watch through the long hours, while Ethan slept the sleep of utter exhaustion, his body finally able to rest, knowing someone else was standing guard. She cleaned and loaded her rifle, made detailed notes of everything Ethan had told her, and catalogued the evidence with the methodical care of someone building a case that would stand up in court. As the second dawn broke and the storm finally began to break, the satellite phone rang. We're moving in 1 hour, Agent Reeves reported. Helicopters and four-wheel drive vehicles. We'll have agents at your location by mid-morning, and teams hitting Blackstone and the sheriff's office simultaneously. But Martha, we're getting reports that someone was asking questions at the town diner this morning, showing a picture of the boy, asking if anyone had seen him. Curtis knows something's wrong." Martha looked at Ethan, who was awake now, eating oatmeal with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling rather than enjoying food. "Then I guess we'd better be ready when he figures out where we are." The helicopters came with the clearing skies, their rotors beating a thunderous rhythm that echoed across the valley, 3 black machines bearing federal markings that descended onto the snowy meadow behind Martha's cabin like avenging angels. Ethan watched from the window as agents in tactical gear and heavy coats emerged, moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation, and at their head was a tall woman with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes, who could only be Agent Reeves. She strode to Martha's door and embraced the older woman like a sister in arms, then knelt before Ethan with a gentleness that seemed at odds with her formidable presence. "You're a very brave young man, Ethan Cooper. Your grandfather would be proud. Now let's make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." What followed was a whirlwind of activity that felt almost surreal after the isolation and terror of the past weeks. Ethan gave his formal statement to 2 FBI agents who recorded every word, treating his testimony with the seriousness of critical evidence. The documents and samples from his backpack were catalogued, photographed, and sealed in evidence bags with chain of custody protocols that would make them admissible in court. A medic treated his injuries, bandaging his shredded hands and checking him for frostbite, while other agents coordinated with teams across the county. The raids began at exactly 9 in the morning, synchronized strikes that hit Blackstone Chemical's regional offices, the Sheriff's Department, and County Commissioner Davis's office simultaneously. Sheriff Wade was in his office when FBI agents walked in with arrest warrants, his face going pale as they read him his rights, and removed his badge. He was walked out of the building in handcuffs, past deputies who stood frozen in shock, and loaded into a federal vehicle, while news crews that Agent Reeves had strategically tipped off captured every humiliating moment. Curtis Cooper, showing the cunning that had kept him free for 15 years, had sensed something wrong when he'd driven past the smouldering ruins of the cabin at dawn and found no body in the ashes. He'd thrown clothes and cash into a bag and was on Highway 40 heading toward the state border when U.S. Marshals pulled him over, their weapons drawn, and their intent absolutely clear. He was arrested without incident, though witnesses later reported he'd wept as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, not from remorse, but from the devastating realization that his comfortable life, built on blood money, was over. By sunset, the contamination sites were being secured by EPA teams in hazmat suits. Emergency water testing was underway in all 3 affected towns, and Blackstone Chemical's stock had plummeted as news of the arrests and the scope of the environmental crimes hit national media. The boy who'd survived alone on a cursed mountain, who'd been hunted and nearly killed for knowing the truth, had brought down an empire of corruption. And as Ethan watched the evening news in Martha's cabin, wrapped in blankets with hot chocolate in his bandaged hands, he finally allowed himself to believe that justice, though delayed by 15 years and paid for with his grandfather's life, had finally arrived. Spring came to the Appalachian Mountains with a gentleness that felt like benediction, the snow melting into rushing streams that ran clear and clean for the first time in 15 years, the trees budding with new life, and wildflowers pushing through the thawing earth in riots of purple and yellow. Ethan stood on the property that had nearly been his grave and watched construction crews frame a new cabin on the foundation of the old, this one built to code with proper insulation, a sound roof, and windows that actually sealed against the weather. The Federal Victim Compensation Fund had covered the costs, along with a trust established for his education and care, small recompense for what he'd suffered, but tangible proof that the system, when finally forced to act, could deliver justice. Behind him, Martha stood with her hand on his shoulder, and in the 6 months since that terrible winter, she had become what family should be, steady, fierce in her protection, and unwavering in her belief that he deserved a future worth living. The legal process had been swift and merciless. Curtis Cooper and Sheriff Wade were awaiting trial on charges of murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, facing sentences that would keep them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Blackstone Chemical Corporation had been hit with criminal indictments and civil suits totaling over $1 billion, their executives arrested, their operations shut down pending investigation. Most importantly, the cleanup had begun. EPA teams in hazmat suits had excavated 847 barrels of toxic waste, each one a ticking bomb of poison that would have killed slowly and invisibly. The contaminated soil was being removed and replaced. The groundwater was being treated with advanced filtration systems, and every resident of the 3 affected towns had been offered free medical screening and long-term health monitoring. The evidence Samuel Cooper had died to gather had saved thousands of lives, had exposed a conspiracy that reached into corporate boardrooms and government offices, and had sparked a national conversation about environmental crime and the corruption that enabled it. Martha had written a series of articles for the Washington Post that won her a Pulitzer Prize, and she'd donated the prize money to a scholarship fund in Samuel Cooper's name for students studying environmental science. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced since his parents died. Peace, real and genuine, not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope. The mountains had tested him, had nearly killed him, but they had also revealed what he was made of, had shown him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. He would live here, would finish growing up in these hills with Martha as his guardian, would honor his grandfather's memory, not through vengeance, but through healing. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not land or money, but the knowledge that truth, no matter how dangerous, is worth fighting for. And that one person, even a 13-year-old orphan, can stand against corruption and win.